You're listening to the Forum Podcast, a production of Calvin Theological Seminary. For nearly 150 years, Calvin Seminary has been a thought leader in Reformed faith and scholarship. We invite you to join us and our guests as we wrestle with the questions of mercy, justice, faith, and formation. We do not have all the answers, but we believe how we pursue them matters. This is the Forum Podcast.
In this interview, Susan LaClear, the Candidacy Director for the Christian Reformed Church of North America, shares her journey into ministry from her unexpected start as a music minister to becoming a commissioned pastor and guiding others into ministry. She discusses the evolving landscape of church leadership, emphasizing the importance of local leaders and creative pathways like the commissioned pastor role. Susan also highlights the need for ongoing training and a culture of continual learning within the church. Continue listening to learn about her vision for the future of church leadership and the opportunities for emerging pastors.
Okay. Well, Susan, thanks for coming into Calvin Seminary and from the denomination. And why don't you just tell me a little bit about you, who you are, your title, and what you do at the CRCNA?
Okay. Well, I'm the Candidacy Director for the CRCNA, which means I work with all kinds of different pathways for bringing people into ordination. So, and I started doing this in 2021, in the fall of 2021. Before that, I was a pastor in the Christian Reformed Church. I started in New Mexico as a commissioned pastor in a mostly Native American church, and I went through seminary while I was doing that and was ordained as a minister of the word. And I served there about 11 years. Then my family moved to Michigan, and we took a call at Alive Ministries in Jenison, and I served there for 5 years before this. I was on the candidacy committee for 6 years before I took this position. So I started to become familiar with candidacy and grow a passion for helping people to move through these different routes to ministry.
Yeah, talk a little bit about how you were called to a church, to a CRC church, before you were actually a commissioned pastor even. Or was it part of the deal that you became a commissioned pastor? Talk a little bit about that process for you.
It was a pretty strange alternate route. So I was actually serving at the time in an Assemblies of God church as a minister of music. I did a little bit of preaching and that kind of thing, but I would not have qualified myself as somebody who could be the pastor of a church, and it wasn't even really my ambition or goal at all. And just through a series of circumstances in our lives where we like my husband hurt his back, he was out of a job, we had a transition kind of happening in our lives. My mom, who lived in New Mexico, had gotten married to a Navajo man there, became my stepdad, and they were serving at a church. He was on council for quite a few years without a pastor because they couldn't afford one, and they'd gotten to the point where they were doing, garage sales to stay open, and it was just really struggling, and they still hadn't found a pastor who was willing to take that call. And we were at a point where we thought, you know what, maybe this is something Lord's calling us to, and they asked me to apply, and I thought, well, I do have kind of a Reformed background. Before I was in the Assemblies of God as a child, I went to Holland Christian. I did the whole sort of I had a Reformed perspective, I think, from that. And my transition to Pentecostal was more due to some experiences I had in Haiti when I lived there for a while. So it's like a coming back to the Reformed kind of perspective, and I could pass a commissioned pastor exam. I had that much knowledge about it, but I had a lot to learn coming in as a commissioned pastor without much background or training. And Classes Red Mesa is where I was. And they basically said, you can pass this commissioned pastor exam. Oh, they didn't ordain women yet at that point. They had an examination for me on the same day that they also decided that they were going to approve women ministers. So there's a lot of kind of sketchy, like craziness that, with that whole move. But so they said, you should probably start seminary too, because you really should have a seminary degree to do this position. So I waited for a few years, didn't want to do it. I had 2 babies at the time that I was also taking care of. And fortunately, my husband was a stay-home dad, so that helped. But I was like, there's just no way I'm going to take the time to go to seminary and pastor a church and all that. But a few years in, I really, they kept encouraging me. And I felt like finally, I need to do this. So my church was really gracious. They afforded me a lot of time in my schedule to go through seminary training. And the classes was just incredibly generous. So I didn't end up going into debt to do that. And so I worked my way through seminary. At that time, Calvin Seminary didn't have a distance learning program. So I went to Western Seminary and did the EPMC program to be ordained in the Christian Reformed Church. So long story. Not made incredibly short. Sorry. It's a long story.
Well, I mean, that kind of gets to some of the discussion that we have later. I mean, the barriers to entry for becoming a well-equipped, wholly formed person, ready for ministry, equipped for ministry. Can you talk a little bit about those barriers that you faced and then what people now are facing as well and how that relates? And how maybe it's changed even in the last 11 years.
Right, yeah. Well, when I went through my process, it was still called ministry associate, not commissioned pastor. It was pretty new, I think, to move. Well, there was an office of evangelist. It had kind of morphed into ministry associate. And there wasn't, I don't think classes were super well equipped to know how to deal with those examinations or that process. And Classes Red Mesa did a really good job of doing that, but it wasn't like there was a training that I could take. Eventually, Classes Red Mesa developed their own training, but that was maybe 4 or 5 years down the road after that. And I think the lack of training for commissioned pastors, the lack of like a clear, consistent pathway that was connective enough to help you understand what it meant to be a Christian Reformed pastor in the wider denomination, not just in your classes. I don't think that was there then, and I think there's some classes that have developed it now, but probably still it's not, that's a barrier. That if you want to be trained, you don't know where to go or what to do.
So you mentioned Haiti. I'm curious what and we don't have to go into the detail necessarily. I listened to your podcast that you
you did?
posted.
Okay.
Did a little snooping beforehand. But when you think of people receiving a call on their heart to go into some sort of ministry, whether it's missions or pastoral, how has that changed from when you experienced it in university to what you see now? Because this is your role, is helping people now at the end of this education then find a calling, right? Is that part of your role? So how has that changed from what was it, 90s, the 90s when you were in university,
right,
to now?
Yeah.
What is the cultural landscape, et cetera?
Well, it seems like there were ups and downs. There have been ups and downs, so I don't want to say it's completely different now than it's ever been. I was just reading an agenda for Synod where they were talking way back about, we're anticipating we're going to have fewer ministers than we have positions, and this is something we should be concerned about. And apparently we weren't concerned enough about it at that time, because we're in that spot again. More recently, I can't remember what decade it was, but I was reading something maybe from the 90s that said, pastors were being trained in just sitting there, and they couldn't find a call. That's definitely not the case now. I feel like the candidates get snatched up by churches pretty quickly, and I mean, that's a good thing for them, I think. But churches can't seem to find enough candidates that are willing to take a call, or even enough candidates, period, to really satisfy their pastor search. So that's been a challenge for us as we try to figure out alternate ways to provide enough ministers for churches and not have them just waiting with no minister for 3-4 years at a time. So, yeah. Does that answer your question, or is it more
I mean, it's more your answer than mine.
The internal sense of call, same, but the external, finding a call, it's just a little different, more complicated. There are fewer people that want to move. People tend to want to stay rooted, and there's a lot of factors in that, I think. There's probably a sense of fit that people are looking for, too. There's a lot of different kinds of ministerial positions. So it's not just you're the pastor of a church. You might decide you want to be a discipleship pastor or a worship pastor or something like that. And so really we need more pastors than ever before because there's multi-staff churches with needs for 4 or 5 pastors. So somebody told me that in their classes there's one church that has 6 or 7 pastors, and there's 3 or 4 smaller churches that have no pastor. So there might be a glut of pastors in one church and a need for pastors in another church if someone wants to be specialized in their ministry.
What would be, when you think about cultural shifts in the church and in the States, North America, what have you seen as maybe some of the whys behind a shift from a single pastor to some of these multi-pastor churches?
Well, I'm sure mega churches had something to do with it, to have a big church with lots of ministries, and you need multiple people. And that was a shift that happened in the 80s and 90s. I think also specialization, now that we have a commissioned pastor option, a lot more people are thinking in terms of being a specialized pastor, a commissioned pastor like an associate, than a lead pastor. I think also there's a hesitancy to want to take on a senior pastor or lead pastor role. Sometimes even candidates for ministry that they've been training for that role, and they're still hesitant at the end, and they think, I want to be under somebody else's leadership for a while, because it's hard, and there's an incredible amount of pressure on pastors for so many reasons. But so coming into ministry, you might think if you're younger or you haven't had much experience that you're just really not qualified to handle that kind of pressure. So there's that. And also just increased, maybe positive thinking around specialization. Like I have a heart for this kind of ministry, and that's what I want to do, and that's who I am. And maybe I don't want to fit into the traditional pastor mold, but I have other ministries in mind. So maybe all those factors.
So how do we, as a denomination, support that and celebrate the good and support that desire to use your passions that God has given you, but then also support, without ignoring, I guess, the real need of a lead pastor in congregations? We were in Williams Lake, British Columbia, and they have been looking for a pastor for 3 years. And it's just this beautiful community of people that is almost a model of this multicultural, probably similar to I haven't been to Zuni, but I'm guessing it's a similar, you have all backgrounds in this place. Much more than West Michigan, we should say.
Sure. Well, as I said, pastors don't want to move necessarily as much as they used to. But I keep encouraging churches, raise up your own pastors then. Somebody in your context may have the gifts to do this, and maybe they need an incremental step-by-step process for getting there. So the commissioned pastor route is a wonderful tool for that. If somebody says, I'll be the part-time bivocational pastor of teaching for a certain number of Sundays or something like that, the commissioned pastor route would enable them to start training for that and be ordained into a position like that. And then they might get hooked and say, this really is what I'm called to do. Definitely, I want to do this. And then, gradually move towards a position where there's, a little more full responsibility of the church and its ministries. So I think that's important for us as a denomination to make sure that we're providing like clear entry points for people with substantial, solid training that's individualized to what they need, not kind of a one-size-fits-all, and that we have those pathways be connective enough to seminary that once you start as a commissioned pastor, you're part of the way there already, and it doesn't take that much of a huge initiative to go, I'll take another step, I'll keep moving towards minister of the word because I do feel a call now. I don't know why it's hard for people to jump into, harder for them to sense a call and jump straight in. I think there's a lot of factors, but if that's the case, I don't think it would be very hard to help them, give them more incremental steps.
I just think of the sentiment, and we hear it, and Bruce and I have heard it on the road, talking to different congregations. We've heard this sentiment of people don't want to move, people don't want to go to seminary, people don't want to preach anymore. I think there's a positive way to look at that. And I'm curious if you have any ideas of how we could think about this desire to stay rooted in a place, in a community, in your context, and what that benefit would be for the congregation because people don't want to move anymore.
Right. Like you said, with a multicultural context, how much better to have a leader that understands those different cultures from the area, local, than to have somebody come in from a different state that doesn't know anything about it and have to go through the whole learning curve. And that's what's been, a blessing at Classis Red Mesa, because their contextual learning program, which nobody could have come up with besides them, to really fit the needs well. They've trained all these indigenous leaders, and now the churches are starting to have, finally, pastors that are Navajo or Zuni, or even just pastors that understand the Navajo and Zuni context because they lived in New Mexico a long time, rather than having to depend on somebody to come over that doesn't know their culture. So there's a huge opportunity for it to become a real blessing. And also it challenges the churches and classes to start thinking about leadership development instead of just depending on I think there's a concept that the denomination is just going to, send them pastors and connect them, and that candidacy is just going to have all these candidates for them. But then they don't always understand that they need to send those candidates. They're the ones that start the process, right? The local church identifies a leader and says, oh, wow, you should go to seminary, send them. And I think that that's been a missing piece for quite a while. And our whole system depends on it. Like, we created this system with the idea that the church councils would be actively encouraging people to go to seminary, but somewhere over the years, I don't know what happened, but it doesn't seem like it happens as much as it should. So we're just encouraging them to just keep their eyes open for people that might be sensing a call, listen, provide some kind of clear, hey, here's a person you can talk to on the CMLT of your classes, and that person's could help you connect with seminary. Let them know about grants that they have, because really the idea that seminary is too expensive for us in the CRC shouldn't really be a feeling that we have, because classes have so much funding, and the seminary provides so many grants. So really, I think it's just a lack of awareness that people have about the opportunities as well. So that is something we can do something about.
When we think about the cultural context, even just in the last 5-10 years, a shift away from church in general, traditional church, a shift of people's attitude toward going on a Sunday and watching someone speak to them, maybe about something that they've heard many times in their life. There's been a cultural shift in this. What do you see as maybe a light of hope, even though that has happened, in this shift of deciding to not attend anymore post-pandemic? I don't need to go back. I've gotten what I need online. I'm just going to continue to consume preaching and teaching online?
Yeah, I think that people are starting to hunger for community. I think they started even back in the pandemic. A lot of people said, online is great, getting some teaching, but I really miss people, and there's nothing like worshiping with some people. So a lot of people have moved back into the church. But yes, I'm sure there's a lot that have unrooted from the church and don't really know how to get rooted again, or maybe don't want to. Social anxiety is a big deal since the pandemic, where it's scary to people to walk into a building full of people again. And I don't think that we're over that yet. I think there's still a lot of social anxiety that plays into people's mindsets. Younger people that I've heard talk about their challenges with church usually talk about the political stuff that happened during the pandemic and that really bothered them. They didn't like to see the church getting involved in political agendas on either side of the spectrum. And that's been really frustrating to a lot of younger people. So yeah, if you have younger people not attending church as much, they're also not thinking about things like ministry. And it really does take a move of the Spirit to create that hunger and thirst in people. And I am confident that God constantly keeps calling his people and developing a hunger and thirst in us because he wants people in community and not alone. So I believe he will keep reaching people's hearts, stirring up hunger. And churches that get more flexible, or maybe more flexible in services and what they offer, but especially more targeted towards building community and caring about people and letting them feel at home, are the churches that young people will come back to, I think, over the ones that haven't flexed at all and haven't changed their methods.
We've heard stories from Phoenix, the Phoenix area, and there's a former student of ours went through the MTC training, which is part of Calvin Seminary, and he has a jiu-jitsu school, and started a Tuesday night Bible study at his jiu-jitsu school, and this is now morphed into something that they're considering now a church plant at this jiu-jitsu school. And it's drawing in people from around the community that some would, yes, be perfectly happy to go to a church building. And some, they wouldn't want to go to a church building ever. But this is now a community that is in a context that makes sense for this neighborhood. It's small, it's bivocational. And I wonder what you see as a future for church growth in that, from the CRC.
Yeah, I mean, anything that's so connected to the community's needs and not just to the needs of the church is going to bring potential for growth, I think, church growth. So, outside the box thinking like that of I'm going to use my jiu-jitsu studio to build a church is beautiful. And I think it's going to be really important to help members even understand that their mission has to do with what they are best at and what they do out in the community. I think churches for a long time have told people to come here to church and we'll do mission together through a program, or we'll go together to a homeless shelter or something. And I feel like churches have to start thinking of, you're a nurse in the hospital and you're a carpenter, and we're going to try to help you see yourself in the mission God's given you, and not see this just as a career and then you come to church to do ministry, but ministry is what you do wherever you are. And then I think through equipping like that, we could see a lot more, maybe not necessarily churches planted, but Bible studies started, home groups, people considering themselves ministers in their context, and then bringing the expertise of what they've learned back to the church and inspiring other people. I've thought for a long time we aren't thinking straight around evangelism and missions. Sometimes we just get very focused on what the church has to do together. And as people's schedules get stranger and they're less willing to come to church multiple times a week and all of those things, then I think the only thing to do is adapt and try to help them realize that the rest of their life is a ministry and equip them for that ministry.
Cool. So that brings up the question, which has been debated for many, many, many millennia. Well, just 2 millennia. What is the church?
Yeah, I mean, the church is obviously the people that God is in the midst of. So, and micro churches and small groups and even just small gatherings together can be the church when they're centered on the presence of Christ. And, there's preaching of the word or even just study of the word, listening to the word, sacraments. All of that can be done on a much smaller scale than the big church, and it doesn't necessarily require long amounts of training and ordination to have those small gatherings. So somebody could start in leading gatherings like that and gradually be trained. I think I've talked a little bit with Resonate about micro churches, and I don't know if I'm an expert enough to talk about this on a podcast, but I'll just say, the idea of ordaining someone as an elder or something where they have an oversight by a council, maybe they have enough Bible knowledge and training to do a good job of leading a group in worship and in study of the word, but they just meet in a home, and there's no building necessary. It's not all about funding. If you work to build a church plant, you might have to spend years, coming up with the money and getting donors, or your classes may be pulling together money. If you start in a home and there's no resources necessary, then that's a whole different thing. And ministry can just be not impeded by all of that. Mm-hmm. There's also, I think, I've talked to some people in Hackensack, classes Hackensack out in New Jersey, and there seems to be some churches that are dying or just small, and so they're using their facilities to bring in other churches and house them because prices are high. So I just heard of one pastor's church that houses 3 different immigrant churches within their walls, and it's a buzzing place full of activity and the presence of God and the word being preached. And it's not all happening from, the actual host church. There's just multiple ministries. And it's been such a blessing to those immigrant churches who don't have the funds to afford, a rent, but they're growing and exploding and very passionate about ministry. So
that's cool.
So we could work together. That's another thing we could do.
Finding the solutions for the lack of preachers can't be a one-person job. So how do you help classes help you in this role?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know if it's more us helping them or them helping us, but I really think that we can do this together. I think that part of the problem for them is that they're tired. I mean, equipping pastors for ministry is something that takes a lot of energy, a lot of mentoring, a lot of pouring into leaders, and some leaders have the energy for that and others don't. Some classes have the energy for that and others don't. So what we want to do as a candidacy committee is come alongside the classes to make that more doable for them. As far as the commission pastor route, which is entirely theirs to craft, we've been talking with the seminary to see if we can help bridge some of the training that is offered in the seminary with something that a commissioned pastor would need, so that maybe they can also the seminary can be a partner with the classes in that. And I think that would relieve a lot of the just how are we going to do this on our own kind of feeling. We have given them a template of subjects in the past and a lot of suggested resources, but it still takes a ton of manpower to actually help somebody work through these resources and learn and grow and be prepared. So we'd like to connect them, I guess, to programs that exist or resources that might help them. And that's one of our goals for this year, I think, is to really be connective. We want to keep the contextualization of the commissioned pastor pathway and make sure we don't step on toes and tell them how they should train their commissioned pastors, because every classis and area has its own needs, and we want them to contextualize. But we want to be able to provide some kind of basic, this is a way that we could walk alongside you while you're also contextualizing and making sure that the ministry pathway is your own, but you're connecting it well to the denomination. So, yeah, we want to help with that, resourcing them. And then we want to encourage and be there to support as much as we can. When they do have leaders that are interested in jumping right into the candidacy pathways, I want to be able to meet with them, talk with them, welcome them as much as I can, and make things very clear for them how to walk forward. And also ease their burden when they're dealing with the stresses that I can identify with, because I went through the same thing, the struggle of, do I want to do this? It's really hard to do seminary on top of having a family and, working in ministry. So we encourage them with ways that they can make that more doable for them, stretching out the pathway longer, just even encouraging them to make sure that they stay balanced and healthy and not putting expectations that they can't handle on themselves. So, that's part of how we work to do this. Ultimately, it's not really about us or what we need from them. It's our whole goal is to serve them. So that's how we look at it.
Yeah, nice. When you have conversations with classis leaders and they do express that tiredness or frustration, what do you say to them?
Yeah, if I'm talking to a classis that feels overwhelmed by, let's say, they just don't know where to start with this, or they're confused by the pathway, I try to meet with them over Zoom or something and walk them through the steps and answer all their questions, so at least that's clear. If they're struggling with the learning plan, sometimes I send them resources or give them ideas from other classes and what they've done. If they have training programs they kind of dreamed of, but they don't know how to start, I try to connect them with Empower program at the seminary, or connect them with other people that have done it in other classes that maybe could be resources for them. But encouraging them, I think, about the great work they're doing and how important it is. I don't know if they get the kudos they probably should get for the fact that they're pastoring a church and also working in these classis functions and just carrying a tremendous amount of weight with navigating pastoral conversations with their leaders, also organizing just classis meetings, and then on top of that, trying to somehow raise up leaders. So my goal is always to make it easier for them somehow, to connect them to something that will lift the burden a little bit for them. And I see a lot of possibilities for that in the future, so I'm kind of excited about this year and the kind of things we can roll out for them and help them with.
Cool. What if you could think of, in 5 years' time, one thing that you could, well, not you, but you and the denomination together and the classes together, if you accomplished that in 5 years, that you would just be like, yes, we did it, what would that thing be?
Oh, I would love to have a connective commission pastor route that connects into the MDiv program seamlessly. So, and I think that we're just on the verge of having something like this, but to have a commission pastor have a shorter, like along the way they achieve something accredited, some certificates, and then master's degree. And so that it feels like I'm doing this, I've got my feet in the water, and I'm moving in a direction that I know that I can continue in if I need to, or if not, I can stop and at least have some kind of a certified, I've done this, I'm trained for this ministry that I'm doing. And as it is, all they have is, they have a commissioned pastor ordination, but no training that they can say that they've accomplished in most of the classes. So I think it's important to be trained. I also think it's important for all of us to have a perspective that we're constantly on a training journey. So in 5 years, if I could just, magically make this happen, I would love to have all the Christian Reformed pastors see themselves as continually in education. And so when somebody comes in and they say, well, this is the training pathway, you'll need to be a pastor, it won't feel like, what do you mean I have to do training? It'll feel like, oh, this is a culture of training. This is what Christian Reformed pastors do. They constantly keep learning and growing. So I would love to see that kind of culture in the CRC. So it's never a surprise or like a sense of, oh, we're jumping through these hoops to get to our ordination goal. But they really understand that training is important and that studying God's word is a pretty big deal. You really have to do it well and do it faithfully. So,
yeah. Wonderful.
Thank you for listening to the Forum Podcast. To learn more, go to theforum.calvinseminary.edu.